Back to the Charlie Marlow Show on 590 The Fan.
We're going to go out to the phone lines and catch up with the H-Man, Howard Balzer, talking a little NFL draft. Howard, how you doing?
Charlie, I'm doing great, man. How you doing?
Doing great, and we were just talking earlier with Cam Jansen before he left, just about how this time of year you'd be so into the draft in St. Louis, and I'm still paying a little bit of attention, but without the Rams, it's just not the same. For you, though, I mean, this is your thing. How many years, by the way? How many years covering the draft for you, Howard?
Well, I've been covering it as I've been covering the NFL for 40-plus, and so it's probably around 45. But, of course, the doing it intensely, of course, happened when ESPN televised the first draft 41 years ago tomorrow. Oddly enough, that date, April 29th, 1980, is the same as tomorrow's draft. When I was on that first broadcast that ESPN did, only about 6 or 7 months after they went on the air, when everybody was saying, what in the world are these guys doing? Televising the draft? What are you, crazy? That's got to be boring television. But here we are 41 years later, and it's obviously going strong. 3 networks, as big as ever, and it's no one could have predicted it back then. Charlie, but did the ESPN draft for about 9 years, and all manner of speaking, whether it's on radio or whatever it's been, it's always been a big part of my year, obviously, these days of the draft.
And you kind of answered my next question a little bit, but back in 1980, and you look at the video of you guys, and they have cards on the wall. And even go back to when Brett Favre was drafted, they're mispronouncing people's names, and you don't have the players there. When you go back 41 years, is it a little crazy of what it's become? And it's this event in different cities, and a couple years ago in Nashville, there's 500,000 people. I mean, could you ever envision any of this?
No, there was no way to envision that. In fact, the one story that I always love telling is when Chet Simmons, who was the first president of ESPN, and had come over from NBC to take that job. And obviously ESPN is just looking for anything to put on the air. I mean, they didn't have much. And, of course, they started in September of 79, and so didn't even have college football. So we didn't even have highlights of the players to show during the draft. But when Chet Simmons called Pete Rozelle, then the commissioner of the NFL, and said, hey, we're interested in televising the draft, and Rozelle said to him, why in the world would you want to do that? And that was the reaction to the NFL. And the owners didn't want to do it. They didn't want cameras there as the picks were going. But obviously it happened. But, yeah, no one could imagine it. And to what it is now and the technological situation. I mean, yeah, like you said, you see those film clips of then. We're all sitting at this little, kind of like a picnic table almost, just sitting at a table doing the draft. And as I was going through all kinds of stuff as I made my move to Arizona, I actually found this little lapel pin, cheesy little lapel pin that had ESPN on it in gold and orange. And I'm saying, oh, my goodness. I'm just looking at that and saying that's got to be a relic. And so, yeah, it's so different. You know, it's almost like when you watch ESPN Classic and you see the old basketball highlights with the players with their short shorts and the White Sox coming up halfway to their knees. And, boy, things have changed in a lot of ways. But this draft has totally changed tremendously.
We're talking with the H-Man, Howard Balzer, out there in Arizona. So we always obsess over quarterbacks, but it seems like this year's draft more than most. With Trevor Lawrence at 1, most likely. I think that's obviously going to happen. Zach Wilson, it looks like, at 2 to the Jets. But then everybody's talking about the 49ers. Could it be Mac Jones? Justin Fields, if you look at different mocks, seems to be falling a bit. What's your take on the quarterback situation? I think everybody says, okay, there's Trevor Lawrence and everybody else, but what do you think could happen there at 3 with the 49ers?
I think just about anything could. And there's been so much speculation about it that I don't know that no one knows what the 49ers are going to do. I would assume they know by this time which one is going to be their pick. But I think they've kind of enjoyed all the stuff that's being said on the outside with people thinking they know what the 49ers are going to do. But like I said, I don't think anybody does know. I think it could be any one of the other 3 guys, whether it's Mac Jones, Trey Lance, Justin Fields. Personally, Charlie, I think Justin Fields is the second best quarterback in the draft. And you mentioned him slipping, and I don't know how, if I had $1 probably for every time I've been asked why has he slipped, I could probably retire. But a lot of it isn't as much as him slipping as it is, and I think this happens in the draft each year, with whatever players it might be, teams or people or whoever fall in love with certain guys that are new. And if anybody had mentioned last year at this time that Trey Lance or Mac Jones or even Zach Wilson, for that matter, would be a top 5 pick in the draft, people would have said they're crazy. You're nuts. They'd ask, what have you been smoking lately? But all of a sudden, those guys start getting traction, and people fall in love with the new blood, the flavor of the day, and they move up, and that necessarily moves someone else down. And Justin Fields is probably shaking his head and saying, man, what do I have to do? I'm in the Big Ten. I play for Ohio State, national championship, competition. And yet these guys are moving ahead of me. But I think somebody's going to get a great quarterback in Justin Fields, and I still wouldn't be surprised if the 49ers do it. I'm not predicting they will, but I know a lot of people will be shocked. Oh, my God, they took Justin Fields. Well, that's because it's the 49ers. You can't assume that things are going to happen just because Mel Kiper or the million mock drafts say it's going to be something else.
Yeah, I'm looking at an ESPN mock right now that has Fields falling to 15 in the Patriots. And I have to say, being from Ohio, I'm an Ohio State fan, so I watched almost all of his games the last couple of years. And I understand there's a greater risk-reward probably with Fields, but the reward seems to be really there in the sense, don't you feel like the NFL at the quarterback position, it's going in the direction of somebody like Justin Fields who can move and get outside of the pocket and throw the ball on the run?
Oh, no doubt. There's no question it's moving in that direction. And the reality is Trey Lance can do that, and Zach Wilson to a degree can also. I mean, he's shown the ability to be mobile and to run. So all three of those guys can do that. But you mentioned that term risk-reward, Charlie, and I would argue there's more risk with Wilson or Lance. I mean, Trey Lance played one game last season, and the level of competition wasn't as high as it wasn't for Zach Wilson. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to be good quarterbacks, but the risk is there for all of them. And here's a stat I'm sure you'll love. Since 2009 through 2016, there were 22 quarterbacks selected in the first round of the NFL draft. And one of them, of course, was Sam Bradford. 9 of them, including Sam Bradford, were first overall picks. Of all those 22 guys, none of them are on an NFL team right now. Or I'm sorry, are not with their original team, and 12 are not even in the NFL. So that just shows you that the falling in love that everybody has because teams chase quarterbacks so much isn't necessarily the way it's going to work out. And let's go back. This year's probably going to have the first 3 guys. 22 years ago in 1999, of course, a season that we all remember well in St. Louis. In 99, the first 3 quarterbacks were Tim Couch, Donovan McNabb, and Achilles Smith. The only one who had a very good NFL career was McNabb. Couch got injured, and Achilles Smith was a total bust. So that's the nature of this, and it happens all the time. And teams fall out of love with guys. I mean, look at the way the Eagles and the Rams fell out of love with Carson Wentz and Jared Goff. It's just crazy. It's just crazy what happens at the position, but that's because so many teams chase quarterbacks. But I'll give you the trivia question. 1999, when that's when the Browns came back into the league, and Couch was the number 1 pick. There was an expansion draft that year for the Browns, and the Rams left Kurt Warner unprotected. A lot of people forget that. They left him unprotected in the expansion draft, and of course, the Browns did not pick him. Not many people knew much about him except for Arena Football. But later in the draft, in that expansion draft, the Browns took a quarterback that was on the Buccaneers roster named Scott Milanovich. And he never did anything in the NFL. And right now, ironically enough, he's a quarterback's coach in the league. But Browns had a chance for Kurt Warner, but of course they went with Tim Couch. And for all intents and purposes, if they had taken Kurt Warner, probably nothing much would have happened with him there because that wasn't a very good team as an expansion team.
We're talking with the H-Man, Howard Balzer, one of the local guys, Ronnie Perkins from Lutheran North, who I remember seeing as a high school kid. He looked like a college kid out there. He had a very productive career for 3 years at Oklahoma. I think it was 16.5 sacks in 32 games. And again, just basing it off mocks, I've seen him maybe going in the 50s, 60s. I guess there's a slight chance of him being a first-rounder, but have you heard much about any sense of where Ronnie Perkins could go, the edge rusher from Oklahoma?
Hard to say where, but I do agree it'll probably be somewhere in that second or third round. But the end of the first round is always very intriguing because in most drafts, most years, there are truly, if you ask the teams, most teams will only have about 15 guys truly rated as first-round picks. And then from the middle of the first round to the middle of the second round they're all very close. And so guys could fall into the end of the first round if there's runs on positions. Now, you mentioned Perkins, a pass rusher. This is not that strong a year at the top for pass rushers. But most everyone believes that it's a good group from the end of the first round into the third round. And so when will that run start? When will the first two, maybe one or two, probably the first guy off the board is going to be Azeez Ojulari from Georgia. But after him, when will the next pass rusher go? When that happens, then teams will be saying, ooh, I better get one now, because you never know if the guy we like is going to be there in the next round. So that's what could happen with Perkins, that he gets in that mix, because everybody's always looking for pass rushers. And once you get into that second or third round, you're getting very good value with the contract and all those things, and there's not as much expectation and pressure for the guy to just all of a sudden be a world beater as soon as he steps on the field. So I think he has a real good chance of being a good player in the NFL, especially if he goes to a team that has good players around him on the line.
You would think this year there could be even more volatility with so many teams playing not very many games, or you're having a spring season. Some teams played 5 or 6 games. Some of these star players said, you know what, with COVID, I'm just going to sit this one out and prepare for the draft. Do you think we could see some craziness? And I'm wondering, going along those lines, any players that maybe other prognosticators really like that you don't, or the opposite, maybe some underrated guys that you feel like will be a lot better than where they're being predicted to be picked?
Well, I think on the first part, yeah, I think there's a real chance for teams just don't have as much information on these guys because of the lack of. Cause most of the time, everyone says, "Well, you shouldn't put too much in the combine, shouldn't put too much in the All-Star games, can't put too much into pro days and all those things." You have to look at the tape. Well, there's not as much tape on a lot of guys because of just what you said, not playing as many games, having the opt-out situation. The other part of it is Steve Keim, the general manager of the Cardinals, mentioned last week when they came into the draft year. In terms of their pre-preparations, months and months ago, they had, through all their scouts, they had 5,500 reports on players. And of that number, 1,800, that's right around 33%, went back to school because of the extra year of eligibility that the NCAA granted. And so because of that, you just don't have as deep an overall draft. I think we could see a lot of teams trying to trade out of some of their later round picks for maybe a team that really wants a certain guy that they really like, and to get a pick in next year's draft when it should be a whole lot deeper. So that's one thing to watch for during the draft. In terms of players out there, I think, as always, the second group of quarterbacks is very interesting because all anybody talks about is those top 5 guys. But you've got Kellen Mond from Texas A&M. You've got Davis Mills from Stanford, Kyle Trask from Florida. An interesting guy is Jamie Newman, who was at Georgia and opted out. And that's a kid with a lot of talent, but there just isn't that much information on him. So I think I don't know if they'll go second round, third round, fourth round, but I think a team that's looking for a young quarterback to develop could get one of those guys and have a pretty good player to evaluate, develop, and again, not have that pressure where everyone expects them to play and they're forced to put them on the field maybe too soon.
H-Man, I always think it's interesting what could have been. Like, you see this with the movies. They'll say, this actor turned down this role and could have been the star of this movie, or vice versa. I'm sure you have a ton of stories with the NFL draft. Anything stick out about maybe a big trade that wasn't made, or an iconic player that was going to be picked by one team and then last second they didn't select that player? Anything come to your mind like that?
Yeah, well, there's a few. There was the draft of Warren Sapp, when there was the rumors of supposed substance use, and he started slipping in the draft and should have been a top 5 pick, and I forget overall what it was. I think it might have been 10 or 11, and the Buccaneers got him, and he turned into a Hall of Famer. Heck, I remember the Rams when they were in L.A. in their first iteration, and they made the trade for Eric Dickerson and got a whole bushel full of draft picks, and hardly any of them worked. It's one thing to get a whole lot of picks, but you still better pick good players that can come in and help. But one of the great stories I'll never forget, and I always like telling, is with Dick Vermeil when he was with the Eagles. And he was close with Chuck Knox. I believe that Knox might have been the head coach when Dick had his first years of an assistant in the NFL and was pretty close with him. So when Vermeil's with the Eagles and Chuck Knox was the head coach of the Bills, he's talking with him before the draft, and he tells him that, the Eagles were looking for a wide receiver, and he says, we're going to probably draft, we really like this kid Perry Tuttle from Clemson. And so the draft comes around, and the Bills were picking like 2 picks or only a couple picks after the Eagles, and Chuck Knox and the Bills traded in front of the Eagles and drafted Perry Tuttle. And then the Eagles settled for Mike Quick. And I use settled in quotes because Perry Tuttle never did a thing in the NFL, and Mike Quick ended up having a really good 10-year career with Philadelphia, and I believe is still one of their broadcasters on the radio. So those what-ifs are always interesting. And, heck, I go back to 99 when the Rams drafted Torrey Holt, and everyone was debating, should you draft Torrey Holt or should you draft Champ Bailey? And you couldn't have gone wrong with either, but they decided to go with Holt. And we know what the Greatest Show on Turf did. Would it have been the same if they had drafted Champ Bailey instead of Torrey Holt? Because then the Rams got Dre Bly in the second round and turned out to be a very good corner. Not Champ Bailey, but still a pretty darn good player. So those what-ifs are always fun. It's funny you mentioned it. I've thought of saying, man, it'd be fun to do just a book on the draft and saying, what if? What if this happened, then the other? You never know the answer to it, but it's sure fun to speculate and think about it.
Absolutely. H-Man, appreciate the time as always, sir, and enjoy the draft starting tomorrow. Appreciate it.
We'll do that, Charlie. Thanks. Anytime. Take care.
All right, that's Howard Balzer joining us from Arizona here on the Charlie Marlow Show on 590 The Fan, 590thefan.com, live from Ryan Kelly's headquarters in Brentwood.